My name's Nick Darlow. I'm here to talk to you about subtyping primitives. So the code I work on and perhaps code that you work on might look something like this. So here there's a discrepancy between the code and the logic. In the code the types are the same, but logically they're not. So an account ID is not a user ID, they're not interchangeable. During refactoring, or perhaps during a mistake, you might end up with a function being called incorrectly, and it's not going to get caught at compile time. In fact, perhaps it doesn't get caught at all. And I encountered this when investigating a bug where an account ID was being used as a user ID. The value was then used in a where clause in a delete function, and it was acceptable in the working of the system for the delete function to do nothing. So I couldn't tell, just because it didn't actually delete anything, that anything was wrong. Even worse, actually, both of the ID types were long, and they were both incremented from 0. So it was not unlikely that you could actually have a user ID that was also a valid account ID and accidentally delete the wrong thing, which would be really problematic. So I thought, what can be done to improve on this? So inheritance seems like the obvious choice here. User ID is a GUID, a specialist type of GUID. Unfortunately, that doesn't work because GUID and int are both sealed read-only structs and you can't inherit from them. So, composition it is then. So, I used a record because I want it to be immutable. I made it a struct because I want it to be small and efficient. I made it read-only because I actually do want it to be immutable, and record structs are not by default. And the record gives a more compact syntax, saves a lot of boilerplate, and I get some free stuff like equality and hash codes. So, now to use it. So here I've defined a user class, which is again a record, using a user ID, and as desired we can see that a GUID is not assignable. It can't be implicitly converted. So great. I made life easier by adding an extension, and I put it into an API controller. Now that bit is, oh yeah, it's on the right. Here's the API controller. I've skipped most of the controller out of it and just showed you the endpoint code. So it's pretty simple, and surely we're done. Well, no. So the JSON endpoint, it returns this, and that's not what you want, or not what I wanted at least. And that's because the JSON serializer treats the user ID object like any other object, and it's got a property on it called value. So when it serializes it, you get something called value. So that's pretty messy. What can we do to improve on that? So here we're adding a JSON converter and we're annotating the user ID. So bit bigger than the average code this evening, so that's good. We've got a read and a write for going both from JSON and to JSON. The details of it don't really matter. I've implemented a standard JSON converter, but you could also use Newtonsoft or something like that if you're a bit old-fashioned, and it'll still work the same way. I've then annotated my user ID with the JSON converter annotation, and hey presto, everything's perfect. Now, it's not quite the end of the talk. You also probably want to store these users somewhere. So I'm going to put them in Postgres because Postgres is my go-to SQL database. So I've created a table, and the ID field I've used the Postgres type of UID, and I'm going to use Dapper because I prefer it to Entity Framework. So what happens when you actually try and get one of these users out of the database or write to it? Well, you get an exception because Dapper doesn't know how to map GUID to user ID and vice versa. Now, I probably could get around this by putting in an implicit cast from GUID to user ID and the other way. But in particular, an implicit cast from GUID to user ID would defeat the whole point. I want the casting to be explicit. So what do? I add a type handler that maps between user ID and GUID. And again, it's pretty straightforward. It's just got the set value and parse. So parse is coming from the database to my type and set value the other way. And it just skips off, well, it just says, I want you to use the value property. So what do I actually do with that? Well, it would be great if I could annotate my class to say, use this when Dapper does its stuff. And if you ask ChatGPT what you should do, that's what it says you should do. Except it's lying because no such thing exists. So, as is typical with ChatGPT, you've got to treat what it says with a bit of a grain of salt. So I thought, where should I put this? Well, a static constructor for user ID seems like a pretty good place for it, except that it doesn't work in one specific scenario. And that's because the static constructor is called the first time that your class is instantiated per execution of your application. So if the first request that my application gets happens to be a get users, then it's going to blow up because it hasn't actually constructed a user ID before Dapper needs to convert. So the conversion's not been registered. So I wrapped it up into a little function and I put it in programmed CS, which I'm not vastly happy about. I've kind of leaked this stuff out of my class and into programmed CS, but, well, there you go. Dem's the brakes, as Boris says. So, with all of this in place, the implementation is pretty clean. And there's some examples of it. So I've added a get users and I've added an add user. The only kind of slight that looks a little bit odd perhaps is delete user. And that's because delete user is taking a user ID. And Dapper, it maps the name properties on the parameter object that you pass it to parameters in the SQL query. And that's why user ID, which has a property called value, that's what I actually want to be used, and that's why I have to use value in my SQL statement. So, in conclusion, I was able to make my ID type safe and pretty much as easy to use as a GUID with only about 10 lines of code, not including white space, which seems pretty reasonable. I've linked to a full implementation of what I've done in case anybody would like to have a look at it and scrutinize it. And I guess finally, when I mentioned to my team at work that I was going to do this talk, naturally they shot me down on the title page. So I thought, just on the off chance that in a room full of developers we've got some pedants, thought I'd say, yeah, this is subtyping in the Oxford English Dictionary definition of subtyping, not the software definition of the word. And GUID isn't a primitive type. So, thank you.